Three crucial summits are being held today as President Putin's invasion of Ukraine nears a month. American President Joe Biden is in Brussels. He will later be headed to Poland tomorrow. It's clear that more serious sanctions are coming Putin's way, with Western military, economic and diplomatic powers coming together in a show of solidarity against Russia.
Putin war machine rolls on, slowly but with no signs of stopping. The raging war has galvanized the West to get its act together. The urgency evident as United States President Joe Biden air dashed to Brussels for a power-packed Thursday. Three unprecedented back-to-back emergency summits of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, G7 nations and the European Union. The aim is to take more punitive measures against Russia and add more muscle to Ukraine's defenses. The West's options are limited. It has already declared it won't join the war. What their military alliance NATO would do is strengthen its defenses in Eastern European member nations by sending more troops and equipment. It will also supply more arms and ammunition to Ukraine to fight any escalation by the invading Russian forces. But they also need to calibrate a response to frequent nuclear saber rattling by Russia. The West's assistance, however, might not be enough to satisfy Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He wants the West to be more proactive.
На цих трьох самітах буде наша позиція, міцна позиція. На цих трьох самітах ми побачимо, хто друг, хто партнер, а хто продався і зрадив. Життя можна захистити тільки у єдності. Свобода, вона має бути озброєною.
There are reasons for Zelensky to be disappointed. While the US and its allies have imposed many sanctions on Russia, Europe still buys gas from Moscow. Ukrainian voices have time and again complained that doing business with Moscow is as good as financing the war. Western nations, meanwhile, have announced fresh sanctions to corner Russia. The United Kingdom has slapped 65 more sanctions against Russian business groups and individuals, including the Wagner Group, described as Putin's private army, and Russian Foreign Minister's stepdaughter, Polina Kovaleva. But will all this be enough to stop the war? A top European Union diplomat, Josep Borrell, has warned Russia will not be serious about peace talks until it secures itself a position of strength. The war may not be ending anytime soon. With Gaurav Sawant in Warsaw, Poland, and Geeta Mohan in Moscow, Bureau Report, India Today.
Can the West meaningfully unite against Russian President Putin, and to what end? How can President Biden's visit to Europe and to Poland actually be a rallying point in this battle? You've got President Zelensky desperately asking for help. Can the world come to his rescue, and in what form? Joining us on this broadcast, I want to welcome first India's former ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Navteej Sarna. So welcome, great to have you with us. We've got with us on this broadcast live from Washington, D.C., Dakota Wood, Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation. We've got Nandan Unnikrishnan, Distinguished Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, one of India's top experts on all things to do with Russia. I want to go across to Navteej Sarna first. Sir, given that we're now 1 month into the battle, how hopeful are you that President Biden's visit to Europe will in some senses lead to more meaningful military and diplomatic pressure being made to bear on Russia, which could in some senses bring this mindless war to an end?
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you for having me. I think 1 month down into the war, President Biden is doing what he needs to do. There is no promise of what this will result in, but he is making a visit which is very important in its symbolism of a US president flying down to Europe and doing 3 summits in a day, and also visiting Poland, which is at the front line with Ukraine. And this is a message of unity and strength that he will try to convey, that NATO stands together, that Europe stands together, that the G7 are together. From what is coming out of the first meeting, it looks they're keeping their cards close to their chest, but it looks like a strengthening of NATO's presence in terms of battle groups, in terms of air defense and naval defense, and also providing through individual countries more weaponry to the Ukrainians. There will be more discussions, I'm sure, on closing up the loopholes in the sanctions and possibly trying to get unity on the energy aspects, which has remained a divisive point in Europe because they're still importing coal, oil, and gas from Russia. So these will be some of the aspects. I think the message will be, we stand together. We will not take an escalation, and they do not want to escalate. I think that NATO Secretary General in his press conference, which has just concluded, was at pains, but more than one occasion, to say that they don't want to do something which will escalate the war. So I think this is very heavy on symbolism, and it will put as much pressure as they can without making it into an escalatory syndrome.
But Ms. Dakota Woods, the fact is the United States so far has been urging others to helping out militarily and economically to some extent, but largely not wanting to do any of the heavy lifting through DC and the arms and equipment that Washington can provide. Is that likely the way it's going to stay, or do you see, to some extent at least, after President Biden's visit now to Europe, America getting more actively involved in trying to bring this to an end?
I think the initial approach by the Biden administration has been very tepid and has been driven more by public pressure and media pressure that we needed to step up. The United States did. And I think that pattern will continue. So I agree with everything that the ambassador just said, that this is a high stakes game. NATO members, the United States in particular, does not want to get militarily involved in Ukraine because of the potential or the likelihood that you would see a military clash between NATO forces, United States forces, and Russian military forces. And so this escalation, a broadening of the war, is what everybody is trying to avoid. So the very sad truth of this assault on Ukraine is the Ukrainians are going to have to fight for themselves. So where the United States and others can really help is militarily continuing the provision of supplies and munitions that enable the Ukrainians to continue fighting. And then on other fronts, and Putin doesn't care about the diplomatic side of things these days, but economically, further constraining, more sanctions, really cutting off Russia from gaining funds, money, that would enable it to sustain its own economy and continue the war fight. So on this latter part here to your question, yes, the United States should be much more aggressive in imposing sanctions and providing more weaponry to the Ukrainians, but also Europe has gotten itself into a real bind at being so dependent on energy, natural gas and oil, as has already been mentioned, from Russia. So to cut themselves off completely would create a very onerous burden on the European economies, on the ability of companies to manufacture things and people to kind of live their daily lives. So becoming dependent on competitors for critical goods is a very high-risk strategy, which is what we're seeing today. So I think public pressure, political pressure will be on the United States and on President Biden to do more, and that would be economically and the provision of military support.
Nandan Unikrishnan, looked at from President Putin's perspective, how would he view this NATO meeting, President Biden later going to Poland, and how is he likely to react to this call for greater pressure? Because we've seen over the past few days, as has been the case over the last several weeks, threats about using nuclear weapons, threats about using chemical weapons, and that is some kind of nuclear saber rattling that the Russians continue to do.
Rahul, thank you for inviting me. Firstly, I mean, let's be clear that I can't speak for Mr. Putin. Understanding his thinking is very, very difficult. But as far as a Russian reaction goes to what President Biden is doing, I think the Russians would consider this par for the course. They would expect the West to project, at least even if they're not able to actually achieve it, project a united front and give the impression that Russia is totally isolated. But I would advise you to read Edward Luce today in the Financial Times, where he clearly says that if the West thinks they have isolated Russia, then the West is delusional.
Why do you want to build on that to explain why do you think the West hasn't been able to isolate Russia from Russia's perspective?
Well, for one thing, Russia still maintains relationships, not just political, but economic, with many other countries, including China, India, Indonesia, Egypt, whoever. And the biggest lesson, I mean, out of what has happened so far, and particularly the sanctions imposed by the Western nations and their allies, is that finance has become a new weapon of war. And of course, Russia is hurting. Half their sovereign funds have been confiscated, close to 300 billion. They will suffer, but as the Russians have repeatedly said, they are fighting for they're fighting an existential threat to their national interest. And this is a battle that they cannot escape. Now, we may agree or disagree with their understanding of the threats that they perceive, but this is the perception they have.
Ambassador Sarna, we had President Biden make a potshot at India, saying that India is not steady in its response and obviously not doing what the Western nations would like. In fact, some oil companies continuing to buy oil from Russia, which again seems like a sore thumb from the perspective of the Western world. Given the unity that the West is trying to project, would India be under extra pressure, or do you think the world is now factored in that this is Delhi's view? The West can have a different view and Delhi isn't necessarily going to change its mind, or will there be more pressure now?
Well, you know, these things sort of are not an on-off thing. It will carry on, I think. But I think you're absolutely right in saying that India's position has been factored in already. And I think as far as that comment is concerned, and if it's related to energy, well, you know, we just have to look at Europe in terms of energy imports. You know, Poland and the Baltics are trying to get a total end to any energy dependence. And today, Ireland has added its voice to that. But Germany and Hungary are very strong. That's a red line, as the Hungarians have said. So I think India is not alone in the position that it has taken. And even, you know, there are other countries. We've seen South Africa, others have taken this position. I think that remark was made possibly in the context of the Quad. And it was a kind of, you know, a chiding message to India. And I think you will see these remarks coming in once in a while. But broadly, yes, our position has been factored into the global landscape.
But Mr. Woods, if you see how countries like Germany, countries like Hungary continue to depend on Russia for their oil supplies and for electricity and gas, the fact is that just blaming India for people in DC to take these pot shots in India doesn't really change India's position fundamentally. Do you think the Biden administration, apart from this public posturing and the odd jibe, which is fine in a country like India can take it in its stride, has really, in its own internal calculations, determined that this is India's position and that's unlikely to change?
Well, I think there are three factors. One, we know that all politics is local, right? So as an aspect of that, there is a domestic audience and domestic interest. Two, nations act in their own best interest, and India is famous for striking a non-aligned, independent path, you know, throughout the Cold War and certainly today. And so India is going to act where it thinks its business interests are at and how it needs to respond to this situation. And then the third part is actually related to the first, is local politics and actually the news headlines, you know, where it has been reported that India and Russia are in an agreement to have a rupee sort of relationship to conduct trade outside of a U.S.-dominated market, which deals in U.S. dollars. And it's not unlike China, which has secured an agreement with Russia for 100 billion tons of coal and other sorts of economic measures. So this does provide some economic lifelines for Russia. But again, I think this important point that every country acts in its own interest. And so what the Biden administration is doing is responding to headlines, responding to U.S. domestic audience, making this case that, well, why is India or China or South Africa continuing to support Russia when Russia has done things so awful as to invade Ukraine? So this is the nature of diplomacy and international politics, and so it's not unexpected. But again, each one of these countries needs to assess, where are its interests at? So India has an export market of $70 billion US dollars to the United States, only $3 billion to Russia. So is it in India's economic interest? Is it in China's economic interest to continue these relationships? And we can't dismiss what's already been said, and that is the dependency of Germany and other countries on Russian energy. So they can make a moral argument about the horrific nature of this assault into Ukraine, and yet their response to that is going to be measured by their dependence and their need for Russian energy to continue to flow in those countries. So this is why these things are so messy, they're unsatisfying, and they're so difficult to resolve. So I don't think it's an unexpected message from Biden, but it's something we need to account for.
Nandan Unnikrishnan, again from President Putin's perspective, 1 month into the war, his army hasn't been able to deliver the land victory he would have expected. From all of what you're picking up from Russian media, their strategists, pundits, people close to the Kremlin, is President Putin likely to escalate given the fact that he has no way of getting off the ramp, as it were, at this moment? Or do you think at some point in time he will be practical, realize that holding Kiev, holding Kharkiv is impossible, and after establishing some military victories in the southern part and areas around Mariupol, having a land bridge to Crimea, he'll finally realize that this is where this battle needs, that this is where this war needs to end?
I am not sure it's wise at this point to speculate on how Putin and his coterie are looking at this war. But what I do pick up by talking to some of my acquaintances, friends, colleagues in Russia is that there are fairly mixed feelings about the progress of the war. There are some who believe that there may have been some miscalculations, that there could be even outright inefficiencies and botching up. And there are some who sincerely believe that it's early days and the problem is that nobody knows what the tactical aims really were. Because the fact of the matter is, and probably anyone will tell you, that if the Russians actually think that they're going to take Kiev, it may take them more than a year to do so, because Kiev is entrenched. I mean, it is an urban fortress. So, and similarly Kharkiv. So I don't know what the actual aim is. But if you look at the east and the south, they have made gains and they seem to be breaking through Ukrainian defenses. And if they continue on the same course, I think within the next 15, 20 days, we might see their Donbas force entirely encircled. So, but having said all that, my personal feeling is, yes, there have been some botching up of the operations. It is inexplicable, some of the decisions that the Russian army has taken. But I would imagine that since I at least don't know what the actual tactical aims of the Russian action were, it was difficult to judge whether there is any success or not.
Except if the hope was to go in, shock and awe, and just ensure that Ukraine capitulates in the way that Crimea did in the past. And if that was the aim, that hasn't happened, which makes it very difficult for an autocrat like Putin to continue to be in power in Russia, Ambassador Sarna, and yet somehow not lose face with his domestic constituency. So his options really are getting more and more boxed in. Diplomatically, what do you think can potentially provide him a face saver and a way of getting off this ramp?
Well, as Nandan has said, it's very difficult to get into his mind. But clearly, this is not the war that Putin wanted. He probably has, according to from what sees as, just reading stuff that's coming out, there seems to be a mismatch between the tactical objectives and the way things have gone. This has not been the Blitzkrieg. It's not been Georgia. It's not been Crimea. And it's not simply a consolidation of the Russian-influenced regions in the southeast. So clearly, he had something else in mind, and something else has played out on the ground. And there have been huge mistakes. I read somewhere that, for taking ground over forces, you need a ratio of 3:1, and the Russian ratio has been 0.8 to 1, which shows that they expected the Ukrainians, they did not expect the resistance they're getting from the Ukrainians. They did not expect the unity, the relative unity, I would say, of Europe and the United States. And they did not expect the kind of arms that are coming in to have come into Ukraine. So yes, I don't think Putin being Putin and Russia being Russia, this is a kind of situation where, palace coups would happen so quickly on such a thing. So I think diplomatically, Putin could go in any direction. He could go for an intensification of the war and then come to the diplomatic negotiating table, or he could wind down his tactical objectives and declare a victory and stop there. And the worst case scenario would be an escalation, a use of one of the weapons of mass destruction, even in a tactical sense. Now, let's not even go there, because that would mean something terrible for the rest of the world. So I think we are poised at a very critical moment, and I think in the next few weeks you will see how the Russians want to take this forward.
The autocrat is boxed in. He's feeling collared. He's not being able to land the knockout blow he would have thought of, and that makes Putin a very dangerous person for the world at this moment. And it's a catch-22. You don't want him to win, but if he loses, he could get more crazy and do even more sinister stuff, as Ambassador Sarna points out. Thank you very much, Navteet Sarna, Nandan Unikrishnan, Dakota Wood, for joining us on the Newstrack. Deeply appreciate your insights. Thank you.